if you actually want to understand what critical race theory is, how did it come about? How does everything kind of tie in together? This is like by far the best thing that I've come across.
Welcome back to Mind Matters. I'm Harrison Cayley, joined in the studio by Elon Martin, Adam Daniels, and Luke Koch. Today, I'm using my NPR voice. Today, we will be discussing this book by James Lindsay, Race Marxism. Came out, I believe, earlier this year, maybe late last year. No, earlier this year, February. And Lindsay based this book on a series of lectures that he gave, which are now available on his YouTube channel. So we'll link to those. So if you don't want to read the book, you can at least listen to the lectures. Alternatively, if you want to skip the lectures and get more data and more writing, you can read the book. So we've been reading this, listening to the lectures. I've just read the first couple chapters and listened to a few of the lectures. I believe Luke's finished the book. Did you read the whole book, Luke?
Almost.
Almost? Okay, so we've maybe got most of the book read between all of us. Maybe we'll come back to it when we all finish it. But we're going to talk about it. This book, Race Marxism, it is subtitled The Truth About Critical Race Theory and Praxis. So it's essentially an introduction to an explanation of what critical race theory is. Now, it's kind of interesting to see how this movement gets portrayed in the media, because there are some controversies, right? Because if you look at it in terms of like polarized U.S. politics, on the one hand, you've got the conservatives who are saying, oh my God, critical race theory is this evil ideology and it's taken over our schools. You got to hide your wives, hide your kids. And then when you see comments like that on Twitter or whatever, or in the news, then you'll get a response from often a critical race theorist that will come up with or an instant rejoinder and saying, usually something like, well, critical race, there's no critical race theories in this theory taught in the schools. It's, strictly a legal theory that is taught in university legal courses or something of the sort. But the messaging is kind of shifted because it's kind of become inescapable it's become impossible to escape the fact that critical race theory is taught in schools, in elementary schools, junior high school, what are they called in the U.S.?
Middle schools.
Middle schools, and of course in universities. And so then it's like, there's a whole convoluted back and forth series and how the excuses morph and shift over time. But this book, what Lindsay basically does is read all of the essential critical race theory literature and then describe what it is. And that's essentially that's the first few chapters. And then he gets into kind of where these ideas came from, the kind of ideological and ideational history of where these ideas came from, going back, to the 60s, 70s, and then further back, going back to, philosophers like and thinkers like Marx. And Hegel, we'll talk about Hegel a bit. And so he gives an entire history of it and an entire overview of it. And just the immediate thing that strikes me just off the bat is that probably for the most part, people who aren't already anti-CRT or critical race theory probably have no idea what it is. And if they do have any idea what it is, then they're like a bona fide critical race theorist. And they have an interest in not having the people that kind of think they know what it is, just have a vague idea of what it is. They've got an interest in those people not understanding what it is, because it's not what it appears on the surface. You might get this idea that it's just anti-racist. It's just teaching about the realities of race and the realities of discrimination, and that critical race theory is trying to bring that to the forefront and to fix it. And that is not, in fact, what critical race theory is at all. It's a very strange worldview, a very strange system. And as we might get into well, we probably will get into this. Like Lindsay's arguing, he calls the book's race Marxism, that it is a form of Marxism for various reasons. For one, that the people that started it, that created it, were themselves self-proclaimed Marxists, or at least a portion of them. And so it has this kind of direct lineage where you go back through all these thinkers. You can trace a direct line back to Marx. But it is different because in Lindsay's framing, the reason he justifies this as being a form of Marxism is that you could essentially call classical, true Marxism, class Marxism, or maybe economic Marxism, where it had to do with the classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and the kind of socialist communist view against the capitalist overlords. And so that was the framework in which to look at things. Now, and the way he tells the story, then along came the critical theorists who, well, and as well as the postmodernists, who looked at Marxism and said, okay, well, this isn't working now. And in the case of like Marcuse and the critical theorists, they were saying, well, look at what liberalism, like a liberal democratic society, has brought us. Well, it's actually made people really comfortable. There's a degree of economic stability and wealth that once the poor classes get a little bit of that, they seem to just become content with it and to not realize that they are still totally oppressed. So we're going to have to figure out something different to do because people aren't getting up in arms about the economic and the class situation. They're accepting their slavery as working class people or middle class people, and what we really need to fix the world is to have a revolution. And so the way to do that is to shift the focus away from those class and economic interests or class and economic categories to, in critical race theory's case, to racial issues. So instead of there being this thing called bourgeois property, capital, now there is this kind of abstract type of property, whiteness, that must be then redistributed because the power is held, the power is whiteness, and there's a kind of like a conspiracy among people to hoard whiteness and use it to oppress everyone who doesn't have whiteness. And if you happen, and whiteness is this strange word, it doesn't mean what you think it is. It doesn't mean, essentially, when it comes down to it, it doesn't mean the color of someone's skin. It doesn't mean a white colored skin. It means it's this abstract thing that just means where the power is, where the systemic power comes from and is controlled. And so if you have minorities or people with different colored skin who then access some of that power, like a black person or an Asian person who becomes wealthy and becomes part of that power elite or that ruling elite, then they are no longer considered, an authentic voice of their race. They're considered to be white adjacent. So they have appropriated for themselves a bit of that whiteness. And so I say this just to underscore the point that I just made about critical race theory not being obvious on the surface what it means. So oftentimes when you'll have a discussion with someone or you'll see people arguing about it, oftentimes the people that will support or defend critical race theory don't actually know what it means, and that the words that are used by critical race theorists, even if they seem like normal words that you think you know the definition of, they all have their own specialized definitions. So if you just look at critical race theory, critical doesn't mean critical. It means critical, as in critical theory, which means that you find something and then you ruthlessly critique it no matter what. It's kind of like the borderline partner, just finding everything they can to critique their partner, just coming up with, everything they do is automatically wrong. So you just have to figure out how they're wrong. And then race doesn't mean race. And theory doesn't mean theory. Right in the name, you've got three words that actually don't mean what they seem to mean. And that applies to pretty much every buzzword that is associated with critical race theory. It all means something else. And if you just read their own literature like Lindsay has done, you can find out what they mean by it. And he's got a really helpful resource on his New Discourses website, Translations from the Wokish, which is not just critical race theory, but it's a dictionary, an encyclopedia of all of the kind of woke terms and what they really mean, like how people who are kind of like professional theorists use these words, and they often have very little connection, if any, to what the word actually means. So, and whiteness is an example, like I just mentioned. So before I just continue rambling on, I want to ask you guys for some initial thoughts on this book, on this idea, or critical race theory in general. Just take it away, guys.
If I might jump in first, then just to speak about the book itself and what Lindsay set out to do, and then what he actually did. I think this resource is amazing in terms of its breadth and depth in understanding what critical race theory is. And also, as he says in the book a number of times, critical race theory is as critical race theory does, which he, also points out is kind of cliched. But it really does come down to that, and he points out places where they even say as much, that you cannot separate the action of anti-racism from the theory of anti-racism, because that's kind of what, for something to be a critical theory, capital C, capital T, it must also have a practical aspect. And so critical race theory is a critical theory in that respect, because it is both theory and praxis or practice at the same time. So again, like his ability to have drilled down and penned down the core tenets and the core beliefs, as well as backed it up with all the citations necessary to support his points that these are in fact what these people believe. Like he supports it with actual evidence from their own literature, that he's not just making stuff up, trying to make everything look bad. He's like, no, this is what these people believe, and this is where they say it, and this is how they say it. And yes, this is a little wordy here, and this is kind of hard to follow, but essentially this is what it comes down to. And then he gives even more supportive evidence to it. It's not just like, any of the 13 tenets of critical race theory that he points out as being kind of the core principles. Each one of them has multiple, 3 or 4 sometimes citations from various different lead thinkers within the community to support the fact that this is in fact a core tenet of what critical race theory is and what it does. And so again, like, it is fantastic in terms of a resource. If you actually want to understand what critical race theory is, how did it come about, how does everything kind of tie in together, this is like by far the best thing that I've come across, and not just for critical race theory itself, but also kind of but also explaining neo-Marxism as well. Like it's got an insightful look into what neo-Marxism is, which was always kind of nebulous for me in terms of the distinction between classical and neo. He helps me to clarify the distinctions there as well. So it's not even just critical race theory. It's so well researched that it's useful for multiple different purposes. So that's how I wanted to start off with.
I was even thinking while reading it that if a critical race theorist were to take the first 2 chapters and just delete the the sarcastic or like critical comments that Lindsay puts in there, that they would, it would be really handy for critical race theorists, because I mean, it's in their own words, everything. It's a very, concise summary, more concise, or more, I wouldn't say concise, more comprehensive and, well put together than the definitions that they offer. Because as he points out, like in the talks and in the book, oftentimes when you see someone, a critical race theorist discussing CRT, they'll say, "Oh, these are the 5, main tenets. These are the 6." They all give a different number, and they never quite align with each other. So they don't actually agree amongst themselves, or they agree amongst themselves, but don't actually have a like party platform. So Lindsay has essentially written their party platform for them. These are our core beliefs, and here's all the people and all the different ways it fits together, and all the support for each from each of these different theorists. And so he's put it together all nicely for them, and they should be thanking him for that, because they can use it. They can just delete the parts where he says this is dumb.
And then it's basically a brochure.
Yeah, it's a brochure. But let me keep going.
I would say that that's part of his brilliance too, especially in listening to his lectures, because in order to critique something, you have to be able to present it objectively and to state things as they are, and that's exactly what he does. In fact, there were several times he was laying everything out about what these people think and have written about that I thought, oh, he almost sounds as though he's an advocate of it, because he presents it so well. But it just speaks to the fact that he's done so much homework on the subject. And then after you've heard him explicate where these ideas have come from, what school of thought, who said what and where, he then proceeds to methodically break down the reasons why versions of these theories have never worked before, and precisely why they're failures and destructive in nature. And on that note, one of the things he focuses on, one of the thinkers, is a individual named Herbert Marcuse, who was very popular in my liberal arts education at the time in the early to mid-90s. Marcuse's books came up a number of times as selected reading material, along with Derrida and Baudrillard and a few others that he mentions, which I had a natural aversion to, or perhaps laziness. Could have one or the other. But one of the things that he points out about Marcuse's material, who was very popular in the 60s, is this idea that the policies and the culture and society that made up the hegemony of oppression, of racial oppression, had to be broken up from within. There had to be what he called a counter hegemony or cultural Marxism that specifically went after religion, family, education, media, and law. And, if this wasn't some kind of blueprint, or because you said a little earlier, Adam, that there was, there's this step between taking it theoretically and then bringing it into actual fruition or actualization. And this is what these folks intended to do. They didn't want these ideas to be merely theoretical. The whole point was to bring them into being. And Marcuse was one of these individuals that Lindsay points out who was responsible for inciting a movement towards putting ideas that would break down the institutions of religion, family, education, media, and law. And, for anyone who's been paying attention to contemporary political and social issues, especially in the U.S. and in the West, it appears as though these institutions are precisely what is under attack. And that there's a breakdown in whatever traditional or cohesive values that these institutions have been holding up for so many decades or hundreds of years. So he attributes this attack specifically, at least in part, to Marcuse and this idea of creating the counter-hegemony from within via cultural Marxism. So I thought that was fascinating. As a side note, he includes the fact that Marcuse was a a Jewish Marxist from Germany, was recruited by the OSS, or the Office of Strategic Services in the U.S., which was the progenitor to the CIA. So he included that in there and didn't get much into it, at least in the parts that I listened to. But I thought that was it was just kind of dangling there as a fact that I didn't quite know what to do with. But it did in part remind me of the idea of the CIA's kind of psyops in the 60s and all the psychological operations that we know that they've been a part of for many years. So not something to delve into today, I don't think, but definitely a piece of the puzzle that I had wondered about. Because ostensibly Marcuse was taken to do analysis for the OSS after World War II to understand the Nazi movement, to understand communism. And then 20 years later, he becomes this superstar for, I guess, neo-Marxism and the movement that birthed one of the most destructive kind of cultural and societal and political movements we're seeing today. So don't know, much else to say about that. But perhaps it's a topic for a later time. And those are some of the points that struck me the most so far.
Yeah, Ilan, just to add a little bit about what you said about Marcuse, it's actually really interesting to see how much these ideas have shaped so much, right? And it's a bit weird that it especially seems to have taken America or the US so much. And then it was kind of transplanted to this whole race issue, right? Which wasn't that much of an issue in Europe. It's actually a very specifically a specific US issue, this slavery and all of that. So it's kind of interesting how that whole mindset got transplanted and then applied to the US context, basically. And maybe to add my authentic German voice and do some contextualization here.
Oh no, we might get banned for this.
Yeah, I mean, we gotta talk their language, right?
Yeah.
No, but it's actually interesting, as we all know, a lot of this stuff comes actually from Germany, right? And it's kind of interesting in that regard that, as I said, that it's kind of went over the Atlantic, but it's maybe useful to talk a little bit about how this whole thing emerged in Germany, because it's difficult, I think, for people in America sometimes to understand. And I think Lindsay, he needed to, put all of that together purely from the theory, a poor guy. I mean, that's really, really tough job, because it's so jumbled, and it was jumbled, over every generation of theory. It got more jumbled and even more difficult to understand. So, I just want to say a few things about that, because you obviously, you must imagine Germany after World War II. It was a very different situation than, let's say, in the US. So you basically still you had a lot of destruction, obviously, in very hard years after the war, and then you had this what they call the economic miracle in Germany, where suddenly everything, the economy boomed and all of that. But the thing is that Nazism actually, I mean, there were still Nazis around, right? I mean, obviously, and so, for example, my dad. He had literal Nazis as school teachers, when he went to school, even though it was, after the war in the 50s and 60s. That's kind of important to keep in mind, because that explains a bit, where all this idea comes from, right? And also at the time, there many people saw communism basically as the good guys, who fought, communists fought against Nazism, and obviously the Russians liberated Germany and all of that. And so there is this context that communism was seen as basically the antagonist to Nazism and the force that defeated Nazism. And so you have this context, and then these kind of neo-Marxist thinkers emerge in the Frankfurt School, who basically have this tradition, right? Adorno wrote that famous book about the authoritarian. What was it? The authoritarian personality. Yeah. And that's precisely the context, right? Because the idea was, okay, you have conservatism that is kind of linked to Nazism. So conservatism is basically a road to or a way towards Nazism, and it naturally leads towards Nazism, and communism is the force that is against Nazism. So that was kind of in the air at the time, and and so they basically brought this whole neo-Marxist idea to the table, that it's we got to see it in a bit of a different context, because the pure class struggle, as Marx had it, it wasn't really like that much of an issue, because the workers were really doing good, and then the proletariat was booming in the 50s. And I mean, my parents, when they were young, they were actually like communist sympathizers, and they told me stories how they went around, handing out leaflets to workers, basically. And the workers were like, I mean, what do you guys want, right? I just bought a new car, a new house, like, so I'm on the roll here. I mean, what are you telling me, that I'm oppressed? It's like, and that's basically what we're seeing today too, right? With the whole CRT thing. So the idea came up then to say, and Marcuse was really big on this, I think. Okay, so there is this consumerist society, right, that bombards people with advertising and all of that, and they are basically brainwashed into thinking that they are not oppressed and that everything is fine because they can buy a new washing machine and all of that. And that's I think that's the problem is, with these kinds of argument, there is a kernel of truth in it, I suppose, because it's we tend to glorify a bit like the post-war era, because it was better in many ways than today. But obviously, I mean, there was a lot of stupid ads, and and all of that stuff just was born there, right? And in that period, and people were kind of like seeing this, and some intellectuals were thinking, I mean, that's not good, I mean, that's pretty dumb. And population gets dumped down. So there is that kind of context. But the thing is, if you take it too far, and you end up with these kinds of arguments that defeat common sense, right? So you're basically telling people they're miserable even though they're happy. So I mean, that's just really dangerous, that line of thought. About Marcuse, maybe to add one point, I mean, he obviously kind of used or combined Marxism with Freud, and came up with this whole line of thought that there's an element of sexual suppression going on that actually needs to be liberated, for the revolution to happen, or like for the consciousness to be raised. The class consciousness is a Marxist term, Klassenbewusstsein in German, and so this is a whole other issue. This whole combining Freud with Marx, and I think we see lots of cultural echoes still of that idea. For example, the idea that closet gays are like becoming tyrants, if they're not like cannot express their sexuality, and they become like hyper conservative and something like that. I think, wasn't it like in American Beauty, this kind of motive?
Yeah.
But maybe so that goes back to this, Freud Marx combination that was really big then. So I just wanted to tell that little story a bit, maybe to give some background. It was actually a very specific German historical situation where all of that arose, right? And people like my dad, now people are screaming Nazi, but at the time there were like Nazis around, right?
Yeah.
And so that there's a whole there's a whole history, and it's kind of weird to see like this very German thing taking on a life of its own, and then getting transplanted to the US, and the whole slavery history, which is totally different, obviously, and then it gets all mixed together and produces this kind of weird, everyone is racist, and you just cannot see that you're racist, even though you are, because your whatever race consciousness is suppressed, and you don't know that you're the oppressor, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, just wanted to make that point.
Well, on the topic of Freud, I had a thought while reading. So I don't know if Lindsay gets into Freud at all, but I don't know if this is a criticism, but I think a possible response to Lindsay's like calling this ideology race Marxism is that you will have Marxists, and just kind of maybe just nerdy academic types will say, well, technically it's not Marxism because A, B, C, and D, right? Because it kind of divests itself of things which are centrally Marxist, like the economic and class basis. So when you take those away, can you really call it Marxism? Well, there's almost like in the literature, there's often like two adjectives that are used, like Marxist or Marxian. And if I remember correctly, I don't know if I'll get this right, like Marxist is like, straight out of Marx, and Marxian is kind of like influenced by Marx. At least that's the way I've come to understand it. Might be totally wrong, but there might be a third one, like Marx-ish. It's like there's a shape to the to Marxism, like that Lindsay lays out. Like you have this property which is analyzed as the thing that one elite group has, and then that needs to be dismantled and distributed because other people are lacking it. And so he's got a more recent podcast where he applies that same principle to all of the social justice ideologies. So you've got like in feminism is sex Marxism, and then like queer ideology is sex, gender, and sexuality Marxism. And then each one of these different fields that are in there, you just take one different quality and you just plug and play, and the same thing happens. So it's more like an overall shape with blanks that you can fill in, and then the formula will work. Or it's a formula, that's a better word for it. And so a possible response or a possible criticism might be, well, are there other ideologies, like either in history or contemporary or in different cultures even, that don't have the ideological pedigree, like the actual line of succession down from Marx to them, that have this formula? I don't know the answer to that. But on a similar note, there's a similar Freudianism going on in the idea of analysis, because one of the criticisms of Freudianism is that it's kind of this box from which you can't escape. So when you are being analyzed, or when you are analyzing someone, you know what the truth is, and you say, okay, well, this is what you're actually thinking, this is what you actually experienced, and this is what your actual motivations are. And then the person says, well, no, they're not. And they say, oh, well, that's just a defense mechanism. You're only saying that because what I'm saying is true, and you don't want to admit what I'm saying is true. And so in an extreme case, psychoanalysis is like a form of, or can be a form of just mind programming, or like gaslighting, where no, this is what you actually think. Well, no, it's not. I don't actually think that. Well, yes, it is. And the only reason that you're saying that you disagree is because that's a defense reaction against us me telling you what the truth is about what you actually believe.
Let me see if I can say what you're saying in a different way, because I think that Freudianism is viewing life and your experience and everything about you through the prism of sexuality and repressed sexuality, where cultural
and
Marxism and death and cultural Marxism is this, like you said, it's just kind of plug and play. If you're a minority, if you are a woman, if you are queer or transgender, there are all of these prisms and prisons from which to view your experience of life that you have not yet realized are the reason why you're not living a more full, wealthy, fulfilling life. So, and Zionism is the same way. I just thought I would throw that in as well, where most everything is what is good for me and my subgroup. And the solution would seem to be to appropriate power externally for oneself at the expense of knocking down everything else, of destroying everything else through revolution or through infiltration via cultural Marxism of all the institutions that have maintained whatever it is that is now oppressing a person. And he had an excellent, I thought it really came down to this one quote that he stated in one of his lectures. Insofar as anything can come down to a single quote, this is one of the most important ones. He says, critical theory exists to induce psychopathologies. By awakening, I'm paraphrasing, by awakening a critical consciousness in him until he is no longer able to function. So, according to these cultural Marxists, according to these advocates of critical race theory, everyone who isn't yet dissatisfied with life to the extent that they're dysfunctional, to the extent that they can't operate and exist within the established norms or contexts of where they are and how they live, they have to be pushed. They have to be told. And this is what you were getting at a little bit before, I thought, Luke. This induced pathology. And it's the reason, I think, why Lindsay, in some of his writings over the past year and a half to 2 years, has been able to appropriate ponerology and to see how these ideologies are indeed inducing pathology in people. It seems to be it's the weaponization of these ideas in order to bring about all of these movements that are supposed to make things better, but in fact have always, in whatever form they've taken throughout history, and he makes this point too, and we've been talking about this too, Harrison, in your studies on Mao's revolution, they've always been a dismal failure in whatever form that they took. But according to these people, well, that's just, it hasn't, cultural Marxism hasn't yet been refined to the point that we are going to refine it. It hasn't been yet perfected in the way that we're about to do. So that is the rationalization that these individuals have given themselves to justify their new version of cultural Marxism, neo-Marxism, this new hodgepodge of ideological possession and identity politics.
There's a point in there that
somewhere
there's a couple of points in there, but there's a few things in particular that I've kind of been like trying to wrap my head around, and that is how, I mean, you know, when when you take it CRT and you look at it through a panorological lens, to use their own framework against them, you see that there's some kind of kernel here, kind of going back, from CRT to neo-Marxism to Marx himself to Rousseau, that's lying in wait, that doesn't quite. I don't know if it doesn't know what it is, or they don't know what it is, or if it is, kind of like in a panorological sense, it can't be stated because it's so revolting. And so, like, one of the things is, like, with CRT and with Marxism in general, they don't have an actual plan for anything. Like with a lot of these kind of liberal ideas, it's like what we talked about on a previous show, where the idea is that man, by his very nature, and Marx would say this as well, and even Hitler to some degree thought a similar thing, where history inevitably was moving forward towards utopia. And so all of the things that they're doing are an attempt to remove the blocks that are in the way towards man reaching utopia, from history reaching utopia. And so that's why they don't have an actual plan, because they just see that as the inevitability, where you remove the brakes of racism, of whiteness and whatnot, man will inevitably reach his utopian dream, by virtue of the fact that is where nature and history is set to go. But there's something in the whiteness as property that they talk about within CRT, that, for Marx, it was rights, it was property rights, bourgeois property needed to be abolished. In CRT, it's whiteness. Whiteness is property that needs to be abolished. And why does it need to be abolished? Because there's something there that's not equitably distributed, and so it needs to be. And so I'm thinking, like, well, what does that really mean? Because, like, one of the reasons why they hate liberalism so much is because it's worked so well. It's like you were saying, Luke, when your parents were giving out pamphlets, people were like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm fine. I'm happy. Like, I've got my house, I've got my family, I've got my kids. Like, I'm happy. I'm content. What do I need a revolution for? And so that's an indication to me that what they're actually seeking is not what you and I would normally think of in terms of, like, something good or wholesome or necessary for life. It's like, for normal people, it's just, the bare necessities and, a roof over your heads and, some family, and that's all you need in life. But for these people, they need something different, and they need to remove the blockages that's preventing them from getting what they want, because that's not what they want. They don't want the normal, house and kids, and you don't even have to look at it from a materialist standpoint. It's like those kinds of relationships. That's not the thing that drives them. There's something else there. And so if you want to, like, try and help me, like, tease out what's going on.
And this gets back to Ilan's comment, the paraphrase of what Lindsay wrote about inducing psychopathology, is that this is what Lobachevsky says. He's very non-queer in his writing. He's basically saying that there are always in any society a group of people who are seemingly, that are disaffected and estranged from society, just from the ordinary state of affairs. And they see the world as this oppressive place because there's something about themselves that doesn't fit into that world, into this world. And so they see everything going great for the middle class, for instance. They see all these people that are happy with seemingly very little compared to the ruling elites, and they latch on to different issues to explain why they're so unhappy, when really what it comes down to is that there's just a fundamental mismatch between the society of people and the way people get along and the way people cooperate with each other and a person. And who knows, a lot of it probably is rooted in kind of the cliched bad childhood, people who for whatever childhood experiences just can't fit in the world. But there's also an important kind of like genetic aspect to it too, because there's a big genetic component to like personality disorders, for instance. Like so in the extreme case of psychopathy, you get someone who's a person with a high probability or predisposition towards psychopathy, who can be born in a great family, with material possessions, but they always want more. Their personality doesn't mesh with normal society. They'll end up being antisocial. They'll end up stealing even though they don't need to steal, or getting in fights when they don't need to get in fights, and then can turn into a white collar criminal or a serial killer later on. So you have this group of people who are totally railing against the system because of their own personal psychopathology, who then need to get feel the need to do something to bring about a change in the situation, a global change, because it's the world it's the world that is the problem. It's society that is the problem, not me. I don't have a problem. It's all these other assholes, and so what we need to do is totally have a complete revolution where everything changes and where everything is good. It's like there's this nebulous idea of another world that we're somewhere where everything will be okay, and that isn't just normal society, which is fine for the vast majority of people. There needs to be something else, and they don't know quite what it is, but what it comes down to is a dream of power. It's like, well, I don't know what it's going to look like, but I'm going to be the one in charge because obviously all these other people, there's something wrong with them. So, and I know I've got a pretty good idea that this world is hell, and so, well, even though I don't know what it might look like, as long as I'm in charge, and the people like me, people who think the way I do, as long as we're in charge, then it can't help but inevitably become what will make us feel like accepted and whole and like we're in the right place, and like society is doing something for us and not constantly oppressing us. So I think that's where the psychopathology angle comes into it, and the inducement of or induction of psychopathology in others, because to get that revolutionary gang going, you need to get converts. So you need to get people that will sign up to what you're doing. So you have to, like Marcuse said, you have to convince them that they are miserable. Like me, I'm miserable, so I'm going to get you. I'm going to have to convince you that you're also miserable. And here are all the reasons why you're miserable. And well, it works to a degree, because there's always going to be there's always fish in the pond. Were you going to say something?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I want just to to say something about that too, because the thing is, this seems, as you said, to work pretty well actually, to convince people that they're actually miserable, right? Because usually there is some kernel of truth in that. I mean, mm-hmm. It began with the whole alienation thing with Marx, right? And that was taken up after the war, big time. The idea that you're so alienated, entfremdet in German, from your work, right? You're just a cog in the machine. Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, I think is a riff on that kind of idea. And obviously that there is a kernel of truth in that, the modern workplace or the modern working conditions that can be pretty rough and pretty meaningless. But I think James Lindsay says something really, really good about that. And he says that even if you come to the conclusion, that it's really meaningless, what your life or what you're doing here or what society imposes on you, even if that's your conclusion, then the proper answer is, well, find meaning, right? I mean, it's an individual thing and everyone can do it. It's something that you have to figure out for yourself, right? And that's the crucial difference between let's say, seeing a certain meaninglessness in a certain oppression from society that naturally exists, and arguably is still with us, and maybe in the earlier days it was even harder, in certain working conditions. But the wrong answer is, okay, let's break the whole thing down. So that's the answer of these Marxist types that seek to disrupt everything, to just stop the machine and sabotage society, basically. And that's where I think where the pathology comes in, or the pathological element, when you just stop seeing a problem and then finding a way to deal with it in your own life, and go about basically destroying the whole thing. So, and it's also one point about that. Another point might be that it's interesting to see that it's often like the artists and creative types who are at the forefront of these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And it might be kind of natural, because usually the creative types, they are like how you say, like they have a disposition towards like feeling maybe a bit oppressed by like the work ethic, mm-hmm. and all the demands society places on them, and to a degree that's maybe even healthy to have such people who are a bit more disruptive, a bit more creative, and don't fit so well into like the standard features of the period in question. But they also might be like very susceptible to these ideas that then go beyond a healthy disruption, let's say, a healthy criticism and healthy energy, that society needs as well. Mm-hmm. And again, uses these impulses and turns them or redirects them towards a very, very destructive philosophy that basically wants to dismantle everything, and especially use these kinds of Freudian arguments, Harrison, as you said, because you hear that a lot, and I heard that also like back in the days, this idea that so it only looks like a happy family, right? But beneath the surface, it can't be happy. They just don't know it that they're not happy, and they just fallen for the propaganda and for the for the cliches and for the pressure, and it's all unconscious, and that's really that's a really dangerous line to cross, I think. And once you get that whole package together, right? Basically, some pathological people who basically seek power and want to liberate their psychopathic selves, basically, and do whatever they want and overtake society and impose their norms on their crazy norms on society. And once you have those, take on like the normal people who are just maybe seeing that something is wrong, or that life can be meaningless, or the creative types who are naturally like a little bit more open to all kinds of things, and once they're on board, then there's a very dangerous and explosive mixture that can basically blow up a whole society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a really good point, I think, and it reminds me of radical environmentalism and how all of the disinformation around climate change has been propagated by the very people who would ultimately seek to profit from environmentalism and carbon taxing and introducing new and disgusting forms of protein substitutes instead of beef, and eat insects and all of these things. And so and you have this diversity, equity, and inclusion moniker also propagated by the same group of people who have the the ability to influence through political and social means their messaging, and you have this whole other strata of individuals who don't realize how subject they are to the lies and the policies that would make them feel good about themselves for identifying and being righteous about advocating for these policies. They don't realize how it's been turned against them. And for some reason, what you were talking about, Luke, reminded me a bit of the movie Fight Club, which some of us rewatched not too long ago, and realized that it was a true kind of description of nihilism in what the Fight Club was establishing to do. They wanted to destroy. At first, what begins as this reclaiming of manhood becomes this kind of destructive terrorist cell that seeks to disrupt in all of these destructive manners. And its main proponent, at the end, we discover, has been suffering from multiple personality disorder. So he's got this, this
spoiler.
Well, if people haven't watched it by now, they're not going to see it. It's only 20 years old. And in that sense, the artist, as you say, is bringing attention in a kind of an interesting way to how ostensibly good movements actually are capable of turning destructive quite easily, especially when they are led by individuals who are in some form or another pathological. And one other point that was super relevant, this idea that so one of the stepping stones in race Marxism and cultural Marxism is postmodernism, which we've talked about on the show here a number of times. And Lindsay's very succinct about that. He says, you have the thesis and the antithesis, but instead of creating a synthesis, if I said that correctly, you have nothing. You're left with nothing. You're left with nihilism. You're left with meaninglessness, and that, as soon as you destroy any semblance of meaningfulness in an individual's life, it's like you're destroying any kind of, or rather you're creating the ability to program an individual off in that new direction, in what whoever is the leading philosopher or political leader, whatever they want you to think or be or enact, that they're going to introduce that. It's like there's a term in brainwashing when you're kind of left with a blank slate. You're utterly bereft of any former values or personality or former ways of thinking. In any case, you are the blank slate. You are whatever they want you to think and believe, because they've managed through their ideas to destroy anything that was of lasting value or constructive to begin with.
I've got 5 points in response to our entire discussion that I want to link together and get out there. So first, on the topic of kernels that have come up. So in two contexts. One, behind all of these ideologies, there's always like a kernel of truth, like Luke mentioned a couple times. And I want to tie this into to bring back the Freud example. So the same thing goes for the example of Freudianism, like the kind of little example that I brought up about telling someone that they're just denying something that they don't want to admit is true, because that actually does happen and that can be true. It's often true that a person is in denial of what they're actual motivations are. So oftentimes it's very easy for someone else to see it. So they can say, no, you're just not seeing things correctly. You've got all these, your emotions are getting in the way. You're not seeing things clearly. This is what's actually going on. This is why you're doing what you're doing. And that can be completely accurate, and the person just doesn't want to hear it and doesn't want to admit it. The problem with Freudianism, or one of the problems with Freudianism, is that, the analyst could just be wrong, but they might be wrong by applying an overall theory that is not up to the task at hand. So not everything, they might be overly focused on sexuality, for instance, and might be missing what's actually going on because they're imposing their own interpretation of what must be when it might not actually be the case. So the way the similarity, or another of the similarities between like this Freudian approach and critical race theory, is it's the same kind of gaslighting going on, because one of the central tenets of critical race theory is that race is the central organizing principle of modern society. And so for a critical race theorist, when you've got all your levels of explanation, the very bottom that they come down to is race, as if everything extends from race. And there's nothing below race. So if there's nothing below race, and you can see it in their statements where this is what they believe, and this is what their ideas are founded on, that race is the source of everything, and that racial systemic power, of whiteness contributes to everything. And because of this, everything has to be viewed from the lens of critical race theory, because nothing, it's not possible for anything to be outside of that framework. So as Lindsay quotes, I believe it was Robin DiAngelo, in one of her presentations, she says something like, it's not how did racism, or it's not did racism manifest in this situation, it's how did racism manifest in this situation. So you'll be put in, anyone can be put in a position, even people that are intersectionally connected to the critical race theory crowd, like let's say some type of feminist, anyone can be a target, because if they say, oh, well, no, this isn't a result of racism. Well, I'll backtrack a bit. Another of the tenets of critical race theory is that every disparity of outcome, or every, is that the word? Every social disparity, or every inequality that you can find, whether it's in test results, or salaries or whatever, any disparity you can possibly find in society is a result of structural racism. So if you compare, a black group with a white group on how many are in a particular profession, if there's a disparity, the answer will be, well, that is because of racism. And if there is because of whiteness specifically, and if there's an Asian population that's even higher than the white population, well, that too is a result of white supremacy. And because everything has to be a result of white supremacy. And whenever that thesis or conclusion is denied, that is only further evidence of a more insidious form of racism. So it is not possible for anything not to be racist. Everything by definition is racist, except when it's us, when it's the CRT people. But even then, they can use that to their own advantage, because like Robin DiAngelo, she can totally admit to being a total racist and just having to struggle through it, and it's a lifelong commitment to self-analysis and change. So it becomes, it's this prison, it's this inescapable box that you can't escape out of. And there's always going to be a response that if you disagree with them, the only reason that you can possibly disagree with them is because you are not a critical race theorist, because you are a racist, because they're racists too, if they admit it, unless they've got really good anti-racist cred. So they have to match all of the intersectional boxes in order to be untouchable. But you can also be a critical race theorist and not check all those boxes and just admit to being, a racist, and to constantly having to engage in anti-racism, which is the praxis of critical race theory. So that's the kind of Freudianism that comes out, and that you can't escape it. There's always a response that will say that no, you're wrong, and the fact that you think you're wrong is more evidence that you're wrong. So you can't argue with it. This plays itself out in in the like paranoid flavor of a lot of it, because like Lindsay says repeatedly, this is a paranoid conspiracy theory that white people have imposed, or historically and continually and contemporarily have imposed this for very precise purposes, and everyone's engaged in it. Whether every person who has whiteness or who is white adjacent is engaged in this either knowingly or unknowingly to reinforce and maintain this system of oppression. And he gives an example from Derek Bell in an example of what he calls like a counter story. So these are kind of fictional teaching tales, like almost like the anti-parable of just kind of paranoid fantasies that he uses to make a point. And of course, because it's a fantasy, because it has no bearing on reality, no connection with reality, it can only be used to take someone further from reality, not to give them a better understanding of the world as it actually is. And so he gives an example of like this town. Imagine that this town with a lot of black, like a black community with high crime, and imagine they were able to automatically just magically get rid of all the crimes. So there's no longer any, no one. There's no youths that are doing drugs, robbing, stealing, skipping school, participating in gang activity. But then what you see is things start getting better and better, and the police have less and less to do. And so all of a sudden, all these police officers and correctional institutional, workers are losing their jobs, and people realize, oh my God, our entire economy was founded on crime being on this black crime. So then at the very end of the story, they realize this, and they find, because it was a magic pill that had cured the crime problem. And so they find the source. So these the people who have discovered that they've lost all of their entire economy find the source of these pills, and they blow it up to bring crime back. And of course, so this is like, Lindsay rightly calls this a totally paranoid fantasy because it has no basis in reality. Like, again, there might be a kernel there that, yeah, there are police departments that depend on, certain activities to get their funding, but there's no economy that is totally like no American city economy that is totally founded on crime like this, that everything would just fall apart, and then there would need to be this like false flag operation to bring crime back. It is just a paranoid fantasy. And this ties into what we were talking about, the ponerological element of this, that the kind of the schizoid and the paranoid worldviews, because like, frankly, like Marcuse's whole worldview is very schizoid. Bell's is paranoid. When you start with these distorted worldviews, that's then it's part of the induction of psychopathology. Now, so now moving on to point number 4, I'm almost done. The idea of artists. I agree with Luke that, and Dabrowski would agree too, and he would call this the difference between positive and negative maladjustment. You need you definitely need positive maladjustment. So these are the people that are maladjusted to society, but they're maladjusted to what I guess I would call like objectively pathological aspects of society. And you often find people like this who are outsiders in a sense, but they're not like the criminal outsiders. Negative maladjustment will be people who are just out to destroy because they don't fit in. And artists are kind of like these liminal characters who can go one way or go the other way. You can have examples of artists who are totally negatively maladjusted, and these could be like the sadists, like Mark, with reference to Marquis de Sade. Because there are many writers and artists who are just like objectively sick people, who are into art and expressing themselves because there's they've got a lot of problems, put it that way. But then you'll get artists who are just kind of like, they are outsiders, and like you say, they're on the borders of society, and they don't quite fit in, but they're necessary, and they create something that contributes to a society. And this relates to queerness, because the like queer ideology is explicitly the rejection of the category and the validity of the category of abnormality. That the very category of abnormality is oppressive against those who are abnormal. And this can apply in a sexual sense, but it can apply in any sense. So, and it can be taken to extremes, and by its very logic, goes to extremes. Whether a lot of these people are aware of it or not. So you can feel like, oh, you don't fit in, and so then queerness is an ideology that's very attractive because, oh, well, that like it's everyone else that's the problem. Just because I don't fit in, that doesn't mean that I should be made to feel any less than anyone else, or you discriminated against in any way. I should be able to live my life however I want it. And there can be, I'd say, some validity to that in certain circumstances, but then you get to the point where there's like pedophiles. Well, I'll just use the example of pedophilia, for example. You have the example of pedophiles who are discriminated against by society, and it's just a social category that classifies them as abnormal, and really we should be more accepting and breaking down all these boundaries and all these categories of normality and abnormality and pathology and psychological normality. So just break that all down. But by breaking that all down, that's what the point of this is to allow people with the most dangerous types of abnormalities to have their revolution. And what most people don't realize, and what Lindsay points out numerous times, is that a lot of the fellow travelers, the people that are along for the ride, who have been convinced that they're miserable, who have been convinced that we just need to tear down the system, well, they're the first against they're the first to the guillotine. They're the first to up against the firing squad once the revolution takes over. That's how these things happen. And then it's the creme de la creme. It's the worst of the worst that actually the people that are willing to use any means necessary, the most abnormal, the most psychopathological, who end up being the ones to come out on top in the revolution. So those were the main points that I wanted to make.
Great summary.
Wow. that was good. And like, if I was going to make a criticism of Lindsay's book, it would be on that lack of really explicating the pathological nature of the people who come up with these theories, and then also the grifters who are intentionally using this as a means of unleashing their own sick inner nature. So, like the pedophiles who get arrested at the riots, the Black Lives Matter riots, the arsonists, the career criminals who all latch on to CRT and Black Lives Matter and all of these kinds of things because they see it as an opportunity for them to do all of the things that they've always wanted to do, which is the oppressive nature of society that they're talking about, wanting a revolution against. That's what they're talking about. That's how they feel. Mm-hmm. And so they're using it for their ends because that's what this is all about. And so that's kind of like my big criticism is that that's not more highlighted and explicated and central. Because that's what even though it's not explicitly stated, it is central to the whole thing. Mm-hmm. This opening up of society for pathological reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the pathology is baked in.
Yes,
and that's what people don't realize. Like it's baked in for two reasons. Well, maybe three. So one, because there's like. A lot of the people that are actually writing down these ideas are pathological in one way or another, like either paranoid personality disorder or schizoid personality disorder. And another is because it's kind of a knock-on effect of when you have a bad idea that just is just wrong. It's by its very nature pathological. It doesn't conform to reality, and it breaks when it comes up against reality. And it's maladjusted to reality. Like, that's kind of the definition of psychopathology, and can't get along in well, if you look at personal psychopathology, it's when it causes you, at least in reference to personality disorders, it's when it causes you problems in your life and in your relationships, and if not causes, if you don't think it causes you problems, then it definitely causes problems for the people around you that you're involved with, and you just won't take that responsibility. So there's these, it's the perfect vehicle for psychopathology, because it's just wrong on so many levels, and it's got actual psychopathology baked in from the very beginning. So it can't help but go in that direction. And that's the case with arguably with Marxism in general, and with with any of these kind of utopian ideologies. It's because this comes back to something I said about CRT seeing race as the fundamental organizing principle, or racism as the fundamental organizing principle of society. And there's nothing underneath that. Well, what in fact is underneath that? Well, in fact, underneath that is a whole lot. It's all of human nature, all of the entire history and propensity of people to get along, and at least in the last several thousand years, to cooperate in like giant mega civilizations. And none of that is taken into account. In fact, it's inverted. Everything that is actually a result of either human biological and psychological nature, that everything has to be viewed as if that is on top of racism, when racism, as it actually exists, is a small subset of the things that follow from human nature and human history. And so it's just completely backwards and cannot possibly lead to anything constructive or creative, or that actually works in the real world.
Yeah. I wanted to bring up one term that Lindsay uses a couple of times, and that encapsulates a bit what you just said, Harrison. I think about this weird idea of substituting basically human nature and reality with some crazy conspiracy like whiteness, or and whatever categories like patriarchy and all that. And that's a Gnosticism, or scientific Gnosticism, he calls it. Mm. And I thought that's kind of interesting how he put it. So he says, like, religious Gnosticism is kind of the idea that we're basically living under the thumb of some kind of evil god or evil demon or whatever, and in some kind of prison matrix that we need to break free from, right? So it's an old esoteric idea to kind of get to the higher level or whatever, and escape the prison that is the earthly existence. And then he says, he finds that bad enough, right? But then he says there's this scientific Gnosticism, where it's not a religious or esoteric idea anymore, but it's pretended to be based on science, right? And these critical race theorists and gender studies people and all that, obviously they are in the academia and in universities, and they pretend they are a science, right? And he also says that the German word for science, Wissenschaft, is actually more broad, and it encompasses the humanities as well. So they kind of use that as a sort of cover. And I thought this idea of scientific Gnosticism is really apt. They basically pretend that they have figured out a way to describe what the whole world is ruled by, and then come to their conclusion. So it's, for example, racism. So they suppress like all of the deeper things that might be going on, like human nature and even like transcendence, spirituality, and all of that. It's just all a result of racism or of whiteness, or of the patriarchy, or whatever the term might be, and that's just super super weird and super dangerous, and I think really has a strong pathological flavor to it, because then you can say, all right, I mean, we are like everything that I don't like, for example, that, you know, if a pedophile doesn't feels oppressed by society, can say, oh, it's just, you know, whiteness constructed this idea that pedophilia is abnormal, or it's the patriarchy, or it's the bourgeoisie, you know, or whatever the term might be, and then can blame like this stuff that is like just, you know, should be normal, and it's like embedded in human nature and even deeper perhaps, and can just brush it away and claim it's this weird evil conspiracy that has come up with it, right? Like family, it's a trope, you know. I mean, it's the bourgeois family. It's a construct of the bourgeois class, you know, and all of that, and obviously of nowadays of the patriarchy or whiteness. Yeah, so it's a really dangerous road to travel, this sort of scientific Gnosticism, and I think it's a very good way of putting it.
Well, I've got some thoughts on his use of Gnosticism, but I think we'll wrap it up here. Yeah, because well, I think what we'll do is maybe next week or in a couple of weeks we'll have another talk on this book where we get into more of the what does he call them, the proximate and deep ideological origins of CRT. So that way we can get into a little bit more of like the historical, maybe even more on the deep ones, because we did talk a bit about Marcuse and stuff like that. But we'll get more into the deep history of these types of things, and then we can talk a little bit about Hegel and German
dialectic.
Yes, and maybe come back to the idea of Gnosticism, because I'll have some things to say about that too. So does anyone else have any points that they wanted to make before we wrap up for the day?
I just wanted to give the definition of critical race theory now that we've gone through the entire show and never actually given James Lindsay's very succinct, very appropriate definition of CRT, because I actually had a conversation with my brother late last year where, you know, he was talking about my parents and some of the stuff that they were talking about, and he saw it as being, you know, it's somewhat silly, especially when no one can define a thing. And so I tried to give an approximate definition, and I realized at the time, it's like, man, this is so overwhelming and so all over the place. Like because it's so hard to pin down and on purpose. So with all of that said, to James Lindsay's, you know, perfect summation, definition, it's actually how he starts chapter 1, defining critical race theory. A belief that racism created by white people for their own benefit is the fundamental organizing principle of society. And then he goes on a little later to say that it is an activist movement based upon a motivated study of what is called systemic racism and how that phenomenon defines power and creates oppression in society. So basically, critical race theory is the belief that racism created for white people, by white people, for the benefit of white people, is basically what underpins all of Western society. So that's...
Yeah, he gives several definitions throughout the text that kind of expand on each other and all come together. So I'll read two more. One other one is, again, from the very beginning of the book. Critical race theory, noun. Calling everything you want to control racist until it is fully under your control. That was a good one. This is the one where he kind of puts a bunch of them together. Critical race theory is a revolutionary and broadly neo-Marxist mode of activism based upon the belief that the fundamental organizing principle of society is systemic racism, which it asserts was created, and this is the part you said, was created and is maintained by white people in order to preserve a social structure that provides a multitude of unjust advantages over people of color, especially blacks. So there are numerous pithy or longer definitions scattered throughout those throughout the book. But those are the ones that come to mind. So with that said, we've finally provided the definitive definition of critical race theory. And we'll be back next week, maybe to talk about this some more, or maybe that'll be in a couple of weeks. We'll decide later. And in the meantime, thanks everyone, and take care.